Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come.
Thy will be done on earth, as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us.
Think about the last time you were completely broken. Think about the last time you were sitting in a room by yourself, at 2 in the morning, or in a hospital waiting room, or on the edge of a bed where the person you loved was no longer lying, and you had nothing left. No words, no plan, no idea what to do next. And then, maybe without even thinking about it, something came out of your mouth. Words so old and so familiar that your lips knew them before your mind did. Words that billions of people have said before you, across every century, every war, every famine, every heartbreak the human race has ever survived. Our Father, who art in heaven. 6 lines. 66 words. In the entire recorded history of human speech, no other combination of words has been spoken aloud more times on the face of this earth. Not a national anthem, not a political speech, not a declaration of war. This prayer, this specific unrepeatable 66-word prayer, has been recited by more human mouths, in more languages, in more desperate and hopeful and terrified and grateful moments than any other text ever written. And yet, and this is the thing that should stop you cold, most people who have said it their entire lives have never truly understood what it means. Not where it came from, not why it was dangerous, not what the man who first spoke it was risking when the words left his mouth on that dusty hillside in Galilee 2,000 years ago. Tonight, that changes. We are going back to the hillside, back to the occupation, back to the moment when one man stood up in front of a crowd of frightened, exhausted, hungry people who were being crushed by an empire, and gave them something so powerful, so radical, so quietly revolutionary, that the world has never fully recovered from it. This is not a Sunday school lesson. This is not a theology lecture. This is the true story of the most famous prayer in human history, and everything that story contains will surprise you. Stay with us. Before we go any further, let me ask you 3 questions. 3 questions that this video is going to answer, and that you will not be able to shake after you hear the answers. First question: why did Jesus choose that specific moment, that specific hillside, that specific crowd to teach this prayer? Because it was not an accident. Nothing about it was accidental. The timing, the setting, the people listening, the political situation bearing down on all of them, all of it was exactly right. And when you understand the world that produced this prayer, you will never hear those familiar words the same way again. Second question: what do the actual words mean? Not in the King James translation, not in the comfortable liturgical version you recited in church, but in the original Aramaic that came out of Jesus' own mouth. Because scholars have spent 2,000 years studying these 66 words, and what they have found buried inside the original language is astonishing. There is a word in this prayer that appears exactly twice in all of ancient Greek literature. Both times it is right here, and to this day we do not know with complete certainty what it means. There is an address to God in this prayer that, in first-century Jewish culture, was so shockingly intimate that some scholars believe it bordered on blasphemy. And there is a political statement in the middle of this prayer, a statement aimed directly at the Roman Empire, that, if the wrong person had heard it, could have gotten everyone on that hillside arrested. Third question: why does it still work? 2,000 years later, after everything the world has been through, the wars, the genocides, the revolutions, the scientific age, the digital age, all of it, why do soldiers still whisper this prayer in foxholes? Why do prisoners still recite it in solitary confinement? Why do parents still say it over the beds of dying children? What is it inside these 66 words that reaches past every cultural barrier, every historical distance, every personal tragedy, and still lands? We are going to find out. But first, we have to go back to the beginning. We have to go back to the world that needed this prayer. And that world was a world on fire. To understand the Lord's Prayer, you first have to understand what it felt like to be alive in first-century Judea. And the honest answer is that it felt like suffocation. Rome had been in control of this region since 63 BCE, when the Roman general Pompey marched into Jerusalem, walked straight into the Holy of Holies in the temple, the one place in all of Judaism that only the high priest was permitted to enter, and only once a year, and proved with that single act that no corner of the Jewish world was beyond the reach of Roman power. That was roughly 60 years before Jesus was born. And in the intervening decades, things had not improved. They had calcified. The occupation had become the permanent, grinding, suffocating fact of daily life. Historians and scholars who have studied this period in depth describe a taxation system that was not merely oppressive. It was engineered to destroy. The Roman Empire levied two primary taxes on the province: the tributum soli, a tax on agricultural land and its produce, and the tributum capitis, a head tax paid by every individual simply for the crime of existing within Roman borders. On top of those Roman taxes, Jewish families were also required to pay the temple tax, a religious obligation tied to their faith and their identity. When you add it all together, historians estimate that many farming families in Galilee were surrendering between 30 and 50% of everything they earned. One ancient source puts it even higher, suggesting taxes were exorbitant enough to cause what he described plainly as financial destitution in many and lawlessness in some. These were not statistics. These were people's entire lives, entire harvests, entire seasons of labor, handed over before a single loaf of bread could be baked for their own children. And if you could not pay, and many could not, Rome had a solution for that too: debt. The empire's financial system created cycles of servitude that scholars have described in terms that are almost impossible to read without feeling sick. Peasant families borrowed to survive the tax season. The interest rates on those loans were predatory and punishing. When the harvest was bad, when the rains did not come, when the locusts arrived, when a child got sick and could not work, the debt compounded. And when the debt became unmanageable, the lender took the land. There are scholars who argue that much of the social chaos of first-century Galilee, the bandits on the roads, the wandering dispossessed, the crowds of desperate people who flocked to anyone who seemed to offer a way out, was a direct consequence of this system. Entire families losing the land their ancestors had farmed for generations, displaced into a kind of permanent, roaming poverty with no institutional safety net of any kind to catch them. And then there was the visibility of Roman power. This was not an occupation that tried to be subtle. Roman soldiers patrolled the roads. Roman eagles were mounted on public buildings. The Roman prefect, a man named Pontius Pilate, who would later preside over the trial of Jesus himself, governed from the coastal city of Caesarea Maritima, a gleaming symbol of Roman architecture and Roman ambition built by Herod the Great on the Mediterranean shore. When Pilate rode into Jerusalem for major festivals, he came with cavalry and infantry as a deliberate show of force, a reminder of who was in charge. And crucifixion, the method Rome used to execute those it considered threats, was not carried out in private. It was performed along main roads, at city entrances, in the most public places possible, because the entire point was the public message. This is what happens to people who challenge us. When Jesus was born, according to historical records, the Roman legate Publius Quinctilius Varus crucified approximately 2,000 Jewish men along a single road in Galilee following a revolt. 2,000 men on a single road. That is the world Jesus grew up in. But the suffering was not only political and economic. It was spiritual. And in some ways the spiritual suffering was the most corrosive of all, because the institution that should have been the source of consolation and meaning, the temple in Jerusalem, the heartbeat of Jewish religious life, had itself become entangled in the very system of power that was crushing the people. The temple establishment, by the time of Jesus' ministry, was deeply compromised politically. The high priest served not because God had called him, but because Rome permitted him to serve. The position was, in effect, a political appointment dressed in religious robes. This meant that the people tasked with maintaining the covenant between God and Israel were the same people who owed their jobs to the empire that was destroying Israel. And ordinary Jews knew it. The tension between the temple leadership and the common people of Galilee was real, documented, and festering. Into this environment, prayer had become strange, formal, performative. The Pharisees, a prominent religious sect whose theology was actually closer to Jesus' own than most people realize, prayed at fixed times, in public places, in ways that were deliberately visible. There is nothing inherently wrong with a visible prayer life, and the Pharisees were in many ways devout and serious men. But something had happened over time. Prayer, for many, had become a signal. a way of demonstrating piety to the community, a social currency. The longer the prayer, the more elaborate the liturgy, the more publicly conspicuous the devotion, the more spiritual status you accumulated. Jesus watched all of this. He saw people standing at street corners to pray so they would be seen by others. He saw prayer that was addressed not to God but to the surrounding audience. And he had something very specific to say about it. The Gentiles, the non-Jewish peoples of the Roman world, had their own approach to prayer, and it was, if anything, even more troubling to Jesus. The pagan practice of prayer involved long, formulaic recitations of divine names, a kind of verbal cataloging of the gods, the idea being that the more names you listed, the more divine entities you were covering, and the better your chances that one of them might actually respond. It was transactional, mechanical. The gods were beings who needed to be informed of your needs and impressed by the volume and precision of your petition. Jesus had a word for this practice. He called it babbling. And he said, with almost startling bluntness, that this kind of prayer was a waste of time, because your Father knows what you need before you ask him. That one sentence contains an entire theology of prayer. It rewrites the whole relationship between the human being and the divine. And it was the foundation on which the Lord's Prayer was built. Now we need to talk about the man himself. Because Jesus, at the moment of the Sermon on the Mount, the sermon that contains the Lord's Prayer in Matthew's Gospel, was not yet the crucified and resurrected figure at the center of Christian theology. He was something more historically specific, more surprising, and in some ways more radical than that. He was a Galilean tradesman in his late 20s or early 30s, from a small town called Nazareth, with no formal rabbinic credentials and no institutional affiliation, who had begun teaching in a way that was making people deeply uncomfortable, both the Roman authorities and the religious establishment. And the crowds would not stop coming. Galilee itself carried a certain stigma in first-century Jewish culture. Jerusalem was the center, the holy city, the seat of the temple, the home of the religious intelligentsia. Galilee was the periphery, rural, a little rough. The people spoke with a regional accent distinctive enough that, later, when Peter denied knowing Jesus in the courtyard of the high priest, bystanders identified him by his Galilean speech. The Jerusalem establishment had a phrase, essentially, "Can anything good come out of Nazareth?" that captured the cultural condescension directed at Jesus's background. He had no school. He had no pedigree. He had no official standing. And yet, when he spoke, something happened that official standing had never managed to produce. Matthew's Gospel records that the crowds were astonished at his teaching, because he taught them as one who had authority, and not as their scribes. That single observation contains everything. He was not citing authorities. He was being one. The Gospel accounts are consistent and detailed in showing us a man for whom prayer was not a religious obligation to be checked off a list. It was the literal substance of his relationship with God. Jesus withdrew regularly to isolated places to pray, before dawn in the wilderness on remote hillsides alone. Before he chose his 12 disciples, he spent the entire night in prayer. Before the feeding of the 5,000, he looked up to heaven and prayed. In the Garden of Gethsemane, with his arrest hours away, he fell on his face and prayed with such intensity that one gospel account describes his sweat as falling like drops of blood to the ground. Prayer was not something Jesus did. It was something Jesus was. And when his disciples, men who had grown up in a culture saturated with prayer, men who had been praying since they could speak, watched the way Jesus prayed, they saw something they had never seen before. They saw a man talking to God the way you talk to someone you actually know. Someone you trust completely. Someone who, in the most literal and childlike sense of the word, you love. It was that observation, that visible, palpable difference in the quality of his prayer life, that produced the request recorded in Luke's Gospel. One of his disciples came to him and said, simply, "Lord, teach us to pray," as John also taught his disciples. Notice what that request does not say. It does not say, "Give us a form of words to recite." It does not say, "Teach us the correct theological content of prayer." It says, "Teach us to pray the way you pray. Teach us whatever it is that makes the thing you do in those pre-dawn hours on the hillside fundamentally different from what everyone else is doing on the street corners of Jerusalem." That request is one of the most honest, human, searching questions in the entire New Testament. And the answer Jesus gave to it is what we are here to explore tonight. Matthew's Gospel places the Lord's Prayer inside the Sermon on the Mount, which is among the most significant discourses in the entire Bible. To understand the prayer, you have to understand the sermon that contains it. Jesus has gone up a mountain, and that detail is not accidental. In the Jewish theological imagination, mountains were places of divine encounter. Moses received the 10 Commandments on Mount Sinai. Elijah heard the still small voice of God on Mount Horeb. When Jesus goes up a mountain and begins to teach, everyone in that crowd understands the implicit claim. This is a moment of revelation. This is a word from God. And what follows is the most comprehensive, systematic, and radical ethical teaching in the ancient world. The Sermon on the Mount covers everything: anger, lust, divorce, oaths, retaliation, love for enemies, generosity, fasting. And throughout all of it, Jesus does something that must have made the religious establishment's blood run cold. He repeatedly takes the received tradition, the teaching of Moses, the commandments carved into stone, and he goes further. He does not abolish the law. He intensifies it. You have heard that it was said, "Do not murder." But I tell you that anyone who is angry with his brother is in danger of judgment. You have heard that it was said, "Do not commit adultery." But I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. He is not relaxing the standard. He is raising it. He is pushing it inward, to the place where the law cannot reach, where only the human conscience lives. And he is doing this on a mountain, in front of thousands of people, with no official authority whatsoever, with nothing but the force of his own conviction and the astonishing clarity of his words. And then, in Matthew chapter 6, the sermon turns to religious practice. And here Jesus becomes even more pointed. He is no longer addressing the broad ethical landscape. He is addressing the specific, visible, institutionalized piety of his day. Almsgiving, fasting, prayer. 3 pillars of Jewish devotional life. And his critique of all 3 is essentially the same. You have turned these acts of faith into performances. You have made the audience the point instead of God. When you give alms, do not announce it with trumpets, as the hypocrites do. When you fast, do not look somber and disfigure your faces to show others you are fasting. And when you pray, and here is where he lands the heaviest blow, do not be like the hypocrites. For they love to pray standing in the synagogues and on the street corners to be seen by others. I tell you truly, they have received their reward in full. They wanted to be seen, and they were seen. That is all they get. The Greek word Jesus uses, translated as hypocrites, is the word for a stage actor. Hypocrites, someone who plays a role. Someone whose face and words are a performance rather than a reality. He is not accusing these men of being bad people. He is accusing them of something subtler and more corrosive. He is accusing them of having slowly, over time, replaced the real thing with a convincing imitation, and of having lost the ability to tell the difference. And then he says, when you pray, go into your room, close the door, and pray to your Father who is unseen. And your Father, who sees what is done in secret, will reward you. And then, after all of that, after the critique, after the correction, after the stripping away of every layer of performance and pretension, he says, this, then, is how you should pray. And he opens his mouth. And what comes out will change the world for 2,000 years and counting. Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come, your will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us today our daily bread. And forgive us our debts, as we also have forgiven our debtors. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. 66 words. 7 petitions. And in the entire history of prayer, nothing like it had ever been heard before. But to hear what made it revolutionary, you have to slow down. You have to read it the way the first audience heard it. Not as a familiar liturgy that has been sanded smooth by 2,000 years of repetition, but as something shockingly, almost dangerously new. And it starts with the very first word. Not my. Before a single request has been made, before a single petition has been spoken, the prayer establishes something that is easy to gloss over and absolutely impossible to overstate. You do not pray this prayer alone. You never have. You never will. The opening pronoun is plural, And in the original Aramaic that Jesus spoke, the everyday street language of first-century Galilee, the plural possessive was emphatic. It was not a casual grammatical choice. It was a theological statement. Whoever you are, wherever you are, however private the room you are praying in, the moment these words begin, you are in community. You are part of something that extends beyond your own skin, beyond your own needs, beyond your own moment in history. The early church father Cyprian, writing in the 3rd century, put it like this: the teacher of peace and master of unity would not have men pray singly and severally, since when any prays, he is not to pray for himself only. When we pray not for one person but for all, because we all are one. And then Father. In Aramaic, the language Jesus actually spoke, the word is Abba. And this is where you need to stop, because the word Abba is not simply the Aramaic word for father in the formal, respectful, religious sense. Abba is the intimate word, the everyday domestic word, the word a small child uses when they toddle into the kitchen looking for the person who feeds them, who holds them, who keeps them safe. The closest English equivalent, and biblical scholars debate this endlessly, but most land somewhere in this territory, is daddy, or papa, or the kind of word that does not require thought because it comes from the body before the mind even activates. Theologian Joachim Jeremias, who spent decades studying the original Aramaic texts of Jesus' teaching, concluded that this use of Abba as an address to God was entirely without precedent in Jewish literature of the period. There is not even the remotest parallel to this, he wrote, in all of Jewish literature. The idea of walking up to the creator of the universe and calling him daddy, the idea of approaching the holy, transcendent, utterly other source of all being with the trusting, unselfconscious intimacy of a child, was, in the religious culture of first-century Judaism, breathtaking. Consider what that meant to the people standing on that hillside. These were people who lived under an empire that used the title father of the fatherland, Pater Patri, as one of the official honorifics of the emperor. Caesar was the father. Rome was the family. The empire's benevolence, or its brutality, came from the father. And here is Jesus, in a Roman province, telling his followers to address God as Abba. The implicit comparison is unmistakable and deliberate. You have a father, and he is not Caesar. He is not in Rome. He is not watching you from behind a marble facade surrounded by soldiers. He is close. He is warm. He knows your name. He knows what you need before you say a word. And you can come to him the way a child runs across the yard toward a parent who is already opening their arms. In the political and spiritual atmosphere of first-century Judea, that was not merely comforting theology. It was a radical reorientation of the entire universe. And then the words in heaven, because the intimacy of Abba does not eliminate the transcendence. Jesus is not saying that God is simply a human father writ large. He is saying something more nuanced and more profound, that the God who holds the cosmos in being, the God in whom, as Paul would later write, we live and move and have our existence, that God is also as near to you as the person sitting next to you on a hillside in Galilee, that the transcendent and the intimate are not in tension, that you can say daddy to the author of the universe, and that both of those things, the daddy and the universe, are simultaneously completely true. Hallowed be your name. This is one of those phrases that has become so liturgically familiar that we have almost stopped hearing it as language. What does it mean for a name to be hallowed? The word hallowed comes from the same root as holy, set apart, completely other, of a different order entirely from the ordinary run of things. To hallow something is to treat it as categorically sacred, to approach it with a reverence so deep that carelessness, manipulation, casual use, are simply unthinkable. And the name of God in first-century Jewish theology was exactly that. The sacred name, the tetragrammaton, the 4 Hebrew consonants YHWH that render what scholars believe was the name of the divine, was considered so holy it was literally not pronounced aloud. Scribes copying the Torah would stop, wash their hands, and change their pen before writing those 4 letters. The very sound of the name was regarded as too sacred for human mouths. And yet here is Jesus, in the Lord's Prayer, praying that this name of ineffable holiness, would be treated with the reverence it deserved by everyone. Not just the priests, not just the scribes, everyone, including the frightened, tired, poor, taxed to exhaustion people standing in that crowd on the hillside. But there is more. In the ancient world, names were not mere labels. A name was not simply the convenient sonic handle by which you called someone to dinner. A name was a revelation of the nature of the named. To know the name of something was to know its essence. The name of God, in Hebrew theological tradition, carried within it the fullness of what God is, the character, the intentions, the covenant promises, the faithfulness across all of history. When Jesus prays that the name of God be hallowed, he is praying that the character of God, the justice, the compassion, the faithfulness, the love, would be recognized, honored, and reflected in the world. He is praying that the reality of God would not be hidden or obscured or diminished by the circumstances of the world around him, the occupied province, the compromised temple, the corruption and cruelty and indifference, but that even in the middle of all of that darkness, the name would still shine. And then there is the passive voice. Hallowed be your name. Not we will hallow your name, as if it were purely a human project. Be hallowed, as if the hallowing is something that happens, something that breaks in, something that the whole of creation participates in. The theologian N.T. Wright has noted that this petition is, at its root, a prayer for the renewal of creation, a prayer that the world would become the kind of place where the character of God is visible everywhere you look. In a world where the Roman eagle was visible everywhere. In a world where the symbols of human power and human violence were carved into every public surface. In that world, to pray hallowed be your name was to make a claim about ultimate reality that went directly against everything the empire stood for. And Jesus taught it to everyone. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. If you want to understand why Jesus was crucified, you can start here. In 3 words, your kingdom come. Jesus planted a theological and political bomb in the middle of the most famous prayer in history. And the fuse has been burning ever since. To understand what those 3 words meant in first-century Judea, you have to understand what the word kingdom meant in a world governed by Rome. Kingdom meant Caesar's kingdom. Kingdom meant the Pax Romana, the Roman peace enforced at the point of a sword, maintained by the permanent threat of crucifixion, embodied in the figure of the emperor who was himself regarded by Roman theology as divine, as the son of a god, as the earthly manifestation of divine sovereignty. When a Roman coin was placed in your hand, it carried an image of the emperor's face and the inscription Divi Filius, son of the divine. The kingdom was Caesar's. The authority was Caesar's. The peace was Caesar's. And it was all backed by legions. And here is Jesus, on a hillside in a Roman province, teaching his followers to pray, your kingdom come. Not Caesar's kingdom, God's kingdom. And everyone standing in that crowd knew exactly what he was saying. The kingdom of God was not a new concept in Jewish theology. It had deep roots in the Hebrew prophetic tradition, in the visions of Isaiah and Daniel and Ezekiel, who had described a time when God's sovereignty would be fully and completely expressed in the world, when justice would roll down like waters and righteousness like a never-failing stream, in the words of the prophet Amos. When the hungry would be fed and the oppressed would be freed and the powerful would be brought low and the humble would be lifted up. This was the dream that had sustained the Jewish people through centuries of exile and occupation. And Jesus was not merely invoking that dream. He was announcing its arrival. Throughout his ministry, Jesus had been preaching about the kingdom of God as something that was both coming and already, in some mysterious sense, present. The kingdom is not here or there, he said in Luke's Gospel, it is among you. When he healed the sick, he was not merely performing miracles. He was enacting the kingdom. When he fed thousands from a handful of loaves and fish, he was not merely demonstrating supernatural power. He was embodying the kingdom's economics, the radical sufficiency of God's provision for all. When he welcomed the outcast, the sinner, the tax collector, the woman of the streets to his table, he was not merely breaking social convention. He was demonstrating the kingdom's citizenship policy, which was, in short, everyone. The kingdom that Jesus was announcing had no room for the hierarchies of empire. It had no room for the violence of empire. And its arrival was a direct challenge to everything empire stood for. And then the second half, your will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. These words are among the most radical in the entire prayer, and they are also among the most misunderstood. There is a tendency in much of Western Christianity, particularly in traditions shaped by a strong focus on the afterlife, to hear this line as a prayer of resignation. As if to say, whatever happens down here is temporary and ultimately irrelevant, because what matters is the eternal kingdom above. But that is almost precisely the opposite of what Jesus is praying. On earth as it is in heaven. The prayer is not for escape from earth. It is not for patience until the rapture. It is for transformation. It is a prayer that the conditions that obtain in heaven, perfect justice, perfect love, perfect wholeness, complete absence of exploitation and cruelty and indifference, would become the conditions of earth. This specific earth, these specific people, this occupied, taxed, brutalized, exhausted province. Right now, the theological implications are enormous. This prayer commits the person praying it to something. You cannot authentically pray your will be done on earth as it is in heaven, and then be entirely indifferent to whether justice is done on earth. The prayer itself is a commission. Give us this day our daily bread. Of all the petitions in the Lord's Prayer, this one feels the most straightforward, the most practical. A simple request for the most basic human need, food, sustenance, survival. And on one level, that is exactly right. But there is a secret buried in this line that has kept biblical scholars in productive argument for 2,000 years. And it starts with a single Greek word that should not exist. In the original Greek text of Matthew's Gospel, the word translated as daily is the Greek adjective epiousios. And this word epiousios is, as far as anyone can determine, not found anywhere else in ancient Greek literature. Anywhere. It appears exactly twice in the whole of the ancient Greek written record. Both times it is in the Lord's Prayer. Neither Matthew's version nor Luke's version. And that is all. Which means that every translation of this word, daily, for the day, for tomorrow, transcendent, supersubstantial, is to some degree an educated guess. Jerome, the 4th century scholar who translated the Bible into Latin, producing what became known as the Vulgate, the official Bible of the Catholic Church for over 1,000 years, was so troubled by this word that he translated it differently in Matthew than he did in Luke. In Matthew, he used the Latin word supersubstantialum, supersubstantial or transcendent, suggesting something beyond ordinary bread. In Luke, he used quotidianum, the ordinary word for daily. He apparently could not make up his mind, and the breadth of his uncertainty reflects the breadth of scholarly uncertainty that has surrounded this word ever since. Some scholars believe it means the bread for this specific day, not tomorrow, not next week, but today. A prayer of radical, daily, moment-by-moment dependence on God for sustenance. Others believe it carries overtones of the eschatological, the bread of the coming kingdom, the bread of the age to come, the bread that Jesus would later identify with himself in John's Gospel when he said, "I am the bread of life." Others see it as both simultaneously, which is perhaps the most honest reading of a word. And one more thing. The bread is not mine. It is ours. We ask for our daily bread, the same communal plural that opened the prayer. The disciples of Jesus were not a community of isolated individuals praying simultaneously for their own private bread. They were a community in which, as the Acts of the Apostles records, they broke bread together, held their possessions in common, and ensured that no one among them was in need. The prayer for daily bread is a prayer for the whole community's sustenance. A prayer that implicitly commits the one who says it to the welfare of everyone around them. If you are asking God for our bread and your neighbor has none, the prayer creates a question you cannot avoid. What are you doing about it? And forgive us our debts, as we also have forgiven our debtors. This is the line that stops people. It has always been the line that stops people. Not because it is mysterious, in fact, it is the most transparent line in the prayer, but because of what it demands. All the other petitions are requests directed outward, for God's name to be hallowed, for God's kingdom to come, for bread, for deliverance from evil. This petition is also a confession. And not just a confession, a claim. We ask God to forgive us in the same measure, by the same standard, with the same completeness, as we have forgiven those who have wronged us. The petition audaciously links what we receive from God to what we extend to others. And Jesus, in the verses immediately following the prayer in Matthew's Gospel, drives the point home with a precision that leaves no room for comfortable interpretation. If you forgive other people when they sin against you, your heavenly Father will also forgive you. But if you do not forgive others their sins, your Father will not forgive your sins. There it is, laid out in the plainest possible language. The word Matthew uses for debts is the Greek word ophelimata, and it is a word with an important double register. On one hand, it means debts in the straightforward moral and spiritual sense. The failures, the trespasses, the missed marks that constitute the universal human condition of falling short. But on the other hand, it means debts in the literal, financial sense of the word. And in first-century Galilee, where debt was one of the primary mechanisms by which the powerful maintained control over the poor, where families lost their land and their freedom to the compound interest of predatory loans, where entire communities were caught in cycles of financial servitude from which there was no legal exit, the word debt carried a weight that modern readers largely do not feel. When Jesus put the word aphilemata in the Lord's Prayer, the people who first heard it were people for whom debt was not an abstraction. It was the specific, named thing that had taken their grandfather's farm. When they prayed, "Forgive us our debts," they were praying something that resonated in the body as well as the soul. Different Christian traditions have translated and inherited this petition differently, and the differences tell their own story. Catholic tradition uses trespasses, from the word paraptoma in Matthew 6 verse 14, which means a false step, a deviation from the right path. Protestant and evangelical traditions, drawing more directly from the original aphilemata, use debts. The Eastern Orthodox tradition and some more ancient liturgies use sins, the Greek hamartia, from the image of an archer missing the mark. All three translations are faithful to different aspects of what Jesus was pointing at. Every translation covers a different angle on the same reality. That human beings, all human beings, without exception, carry within them things they have done, things they have failed to do, things they cannot undo, that require a grace beyond what they can generate themselves. And that this grace, the grace of being forgiven, is intimately, irreversibly, and somewhat terrifyingly connected to the grace they are willing to extend to others. There is a famous parable that Jesus told to illustrate this connection, recorded in Matthew 18. A king called in a servant who owed him an enormous sum, 10,000 talents, an almost inconceivable figure, the equivalent of tens of millions of dollars in modern terms. And then the final clause of the prayer's petitions, "But deliver us from evil," or, as the original Greek has it, from the paneros, which is either the evil one, a personal entity, the adversary that Jesus himself encountered in the wilderness, or evil in its abstract, cosmic, systemic sense. Probably both. John Calvin, who spent years studying this prayer, concluded that there was little real difference between the two interpretations, and that the question was therefore of no real consequence. Whether you understand evil as a force or a figure, the petition is the same: protect us from the thing that wants to destroy us. We are not strong enough on our own. We have never been strong enough on our own. This is not a prayer of self-sufficiency. It is a prayer of radical, honest acknowledgement of human vulnerability. And it is, in its way, the most universally human line in the prayer, because there is no one who has lived long enough to have something at stake who does not know, in their bones, the reality that this petition names. Before we go any deeper into this story, and there is so much more that we have not yet told you, I want to take just a moment to ask you something. Where in the world are you watching this right now? Drop it in the comments. It does not matter if it is a city or a country or just a state, I want to know. Because one of the most astonishing things about this prayer is that it is being said right now, at this exact moment, in languages you and I may never have heard. And the fact that you are here watching this, thinking about these words, makes you part of that same global community that has been circling this prayer for 2,000 years. Let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to hear from you. And if this story is moving you, if you want to be here for everything that is still coming in this video and everything we are building on this channel, hit that subscribe button right now so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. We have so much more to tell you, and we are just getting started. For yours is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever and ever. Amen. These are the words that close the Lord's Prayer in most Protestant and evangelical churches around the world. They are among the most beautiful and resonant lines in the Christian devotional tradition. And they are not in the oldest manuscripts of Matthew's Gospel. This is a fact that surprises many people when they first encounter it, and it is worth sitting with because what it reveals about the nature of the prayer, and about the living tradition that has carried it forward, is itself a form of revelation. The earliest Greek manuscripts of Matthew 6, the ancient papyri and parchments that scholars have painstakingly assembled and analyzed, end the prayer with "Deliver us from evil." Full stop. The doxology, "For yours is the kingdom, the power, and the glory," simply is not there in the oldest texts. It appears first in a document called the Didache. The Didache is one of the earliest non-biblical Christian texts we possess, a kind of instruction manual for early Christian communities, probably written somewhere between 80 and 110 CE, making it roughly contemporaneous with the later New Testament writings. In chapter 8, the Didache instructs Christians to pray the Lord's Prayer 3 times a day, echoing the Jewish practice of the Amidah, the standing prayer recited at fixed hours, and it appends a doxology that is similar to, though not identical with, the one familiar from modern Protestant liturgy. Over the following centuries, the doxology was incorporated into some manuscript copies of Matthew, and from there into the broader liturgical tradition. By the time William Tyndale was translating the Bible into English in 1526, the doxology was already embedded in the Greek New Testament texts he was working from, and it passed through his translation into every subsequent English version, including the 1611 King James Bible, where it has remained ever since. The language of the doxology itself is drawn directly from the Hebrew Bible, specifically from a prayer that King David offered at the dedication of the temple treasures, recorded in 1 Chronicles, chapter 29. "Yours, Lord, is the greatness and the power and the glory and the majesty and the splendor," David prays, "for everything in heaven and earth is yours." The early Christians who added the doxology to the Lord's Prayer were not inventing something new. They were reaching back into the deep reservoir of the Hebrew scriptural tradition and drawing out a fitting conclusion, a crown of praise to place on the head of the prayer that Jesus gave. And whether or not it was in the original, the theological logic of the doxology is impeccable. The prayer begins with Our Father, a claim of relationship, of belonging, of intimacy. It moves through petition for provision, for forgiveness, for protection. And it ends by returning to where it began, with God. Yours is the kingdom, not Caesar's, not Rome's, not any human power structures. Yours. The prayer opens in relationship and closes in surrender, and every line in between is a movement between those two poles. When the first followers of Jesus prayed the Lord's Prayer, they were not praying in churches. There were no churches. They were praying in houses, in small back rooms with the door closed, because the document that told them to pray this way was written by a man who had been crucified by Rome for sedition. The Didache's instruction to pray 3 times a day was an act of deliberate counterformation. These communities were surrounded by an empire that had its own liturgies, its own prayers, its own claims on ultimate loyalty. The Roman religious calendar was dense with festivals honoring the gods of the state, Jupiter, Mars, Venus, and with rituals honoring the divine emperor. To refuse these practices, to gather instead in someone's house and pray Our Father to a different sovereign, was not a private religious choice. It was a political act, and it carried real risk. The first formal Roman persecution of Christians is generally dated to the reign of Nero, in 64 CE, following the Great Fire of Rome. Nero needed a scapegoat for the disaster, and the Christians, already regarded by many Romans as a strange, secretive, antisocial sect, were convenient. Tacitus, writing a generation later, describes the tortures visited upon them with an almost queasy specificity. Some were covered with animal skins and torn by dogs. Others were set on fire to illuminate Nero's gardens at night. It was in this period that both Peter and Paul are believed to have been executed in Rome. And what did these people pray in the hours before their deaths? The evidence, fragmentary, precious, and heartbreaking, suggests they prayed the prayer they had been taught to pray 3 times a day. They prayed, presumably, Our Father. They prayed, presumably, Your kingdom come. And they meant it. In the most literal, urgent, non-metaphorical sense, they meant it. Come. Now. Come. The martyrdom of Perpetua of Carthage in 203 CE is among the most thoroughly documented in early Christian history. Perpetua was a young noblewoman, educated, from a good family, the mother of a nursing infant, who was arrested for refusing to sacrifice to the Roman gods. Her own account of her imprisonment and trial, written in her own hand and preserved in the historical record, is one of the most extraordinary personal documents of the ancient world. It is a record of a person walking toward death with complete clarity and complete peace, sustained entirely by prayer, by community, and by a vision of the kingdom that was, for her, more real than the arena waiting at the end of it all. She was led into the amphitheater on the day of her execution. The account records, with a shining face and a calm step, as the beloved of God, as a wife of Christ, and the gaze of all fell upon her. She was 22 years old. She prayed to the end. What she prayed we can only guess, but we can make an educated guess. The practice of praying the Lord's Prayer 3 times a day, morning, midday, and evening, spread through the early Christian communities as a kind of radical daily recalibration. Every time those words were spoken, they constituted a small act of counter-imperial resistance. Every time someone said, "Your kingdom come," in a world governed by Caesar's kingdom, they were renewing a claim about the nature of reality that Rome could not tolerate. And yet Rome, for all its power and for all its crucifixions, could not stop it. The prayer spread. Along trade routes, along the roads the legions had built, through letter and mouth and community, from house to house, city to city, province to province. The empire that had killed the man who first spoke the prayer found itself unable to kill the prayer itself. 3 times a day, in 100 languages, in 1,000 cities, people kept saying it. "Our Father, your kingdom come, deliver us from evil. Amen." 1,000 years later, in a very different world, the Lord's Prayer would find itself at the center of a different kind of conflict. Not a conflict between Christianity and empire, but a conflict within Christianity itself. The Protestant Reformation of the 16th century was, at its heart, a dispute about authority. Who had the right to interpret Scripture? Who had the right to mediate between ordinary people and God? Was the elaborate institutional machinery of the medieval Catholic Church a divinely ordained structure? Or was it, as Martin Luther increasingly came to believe, a human invention that had accumulated power at the expense of the ordinary believer's direct access to God? The Lord's Prayer was, in this context, both a weapon and a battlefield. Martin Luther, who nailed his 95 Theses to the door of the Castle Church in Wittenberg in 1517 and thereby set the Reformation in motion, had a profound and lifelong relationship with the Lord's Prayer. He wrote about it extensively, most fully in the Large Catechism of 1529, which became one of the foundational documents of Lutheran theology. For Luther, the Lord's Prayer was not primarily a liturgical formula to be recited. It was a school of the soul, a daily curriculum in what it means to want what God wants. Each petition, in Luther's reading, was both a request and a formation, a practice that, undertaken honestly and regularly, gradually reshaped the desires and orientations of the one praying until they began, in some measure, to align with the desires and orientations of God. Luther took the opening words "Our Father" so seriously that he wrote, "What a terrible thing it would be if a son spoke to his father in no other tone than that used toward the most exalted majesty, when his heart is full of childlike trust and he dares to call him simply Father." This is exactly how we should approach God. The prayer became, in the hands of the Reformers, a democratic document in the deepest sense. If ordinary people could pray directly to God, not through the mediation of a priest, not through the accumulated merit of masses said on their behalf, not through the intercession of saints whose petitions carried more weight than their own, then the entire hierarchical structure of medieval devotional life was called into question. The Lord's Prayer, taught by Jesus to everyone on that hillside, given by Martin Luther and William Tyndale and John Calvin to readers in their own languages, was a prayer that required no intermediary. Our Father, not the priest's father. Our Father, yours too. The Doxology became, somewhat ironically, a marker of this division. Protestant churches kept it, Catholic churches for a period dropped it, and the presence or absence of those closing words of praise became a way of identifying which side of the Reformation divide a community stood on. William Tyndale, whose 1526 English translation of the New Testament brought the Lord's Prayer into the hands of English readers for the first time, paid for that act of translation with his life. He was condemned as a heretic, strangled, and then burned at the stake in 1536. He was 42 years old. His crime, in the eyes of the ecclesiastical authorities who condemned him, was making the Bible accessible to common people without institutional mediation, enabling a plowboy to know more of the Scripture than the priests. The Lord's Prayer that Tyndale translated, "Our Father which art in heaven, hallowed be thy name," is still recognizable in the versions recited today. His words survived him. His translation survived him. The prayer survived him, as it has survived everyone who has ever said it. Fast forward now for 100 years. The year is 1944. The battlefields of Europe and the Pacific are among the most brutal and dehumanizing environments human beings have ever created for themselves. and in the personal letters and diaries of soldiers from both sides of the conflict, letters written in English and German and Italian and French and Japanese, letters found in breast pockets and kit bags and foxholes. One text appears again and again and again. You already know which one. Historians and archivists who have spent careers studying World War II personal correspondence have noted with consistent surprise the frequency with which the Lord's Prayer appears in these documents. Not as a religious statement, not as a theological position, but as pure, raw survival, the reaching out of a human hand toward something that might be large enough to hold what was happening. There is an account from the beaches of Normandy on D-Day, June 6, 1944, where American soldiers clinging to the seawall at Omaha Beach, pinned down by German machine gun fire, were heard reciting the Lord's Prayer together. Not in a formal, liturgical way. In fragments. In whispers. In the pauses between incoming fire. Give us this day our daily bread. That petition, which in the original context of first-century Galilee referred to the manna in the wilderness, to radical trust and daily dependence, took on a new and terrible specificity in the seconds between one volley of gunfire and the next. This day. This specific, terrifying, possibly final day. Give us this day. And then the next line, and forgive us our debts as we also have forgiven our debtors. Men who were about to kill or be killed, praying for forgiveness, praying to be able to forgive. The depth of what that means resists language entirely. In the concentration camps of Nazi Germany, Dachau, Bergen-Belsen, Auschwitz, Christian prisoners, alongside the Jewish prisoners who were the primary targets of the Nazi genocide, maintained their faith and their sanity in conditions designed to destroy both. Corrie ten Boom, the Dutch Christian who survived Ravensbruck concentration camp after being arrested for hiding Jewish families in her home, wrote in her memoir about praying the Lord's Prayer in the barracks at night. Quietly, in the dark, in a room full of dying women, the lice crawling and the searchlights sweeping and the sounds of the camp pressing in from all sides. She wrote that in those moments, the words Our Father had a weight and a warmth that they had never had in her comfortable middle-class Dutch life before the war. Because the claim they made was so outrageous in that place. Our Father, in a place like this, your kingdom come in a world capable of this. And yet she prayed it, and it held her. And now we have arrived at the moment that this entire documentary has been building toward. The revelation that does not undermine everything you have heard tonight, but reframes it completely. And it starts with a question that should have been obvious from the beginning, but that most people have never thought to ask. Did Jesus mean for this prayer to be repeated word for word? Or did he mean something else entirely? And when you look at the original text with honest eyes, the answer is both simpler and more challenging than most people expect. Matthew's Gospel introduces the Lord's Prayer with the words this, then, is how you should pray. The Greek word Matthew uses, hautos, is the word for in this manner, or in this way or after this fashion. It is a word of template, of pattern, of model. It is emphatically not the word for repeat this formula verbatim in perpetuity. Luke's Gospel is even more explicit. When he asked Jesus to teach them to pray, Jesus responds in Luke 11 verse 2 by saying when you pray, say, and then he gives a shorter form of the prayer. The word say is there. Luke's version does seem more clearly to intend literal repetition. But even in Luke, what is given is a shorter, simpler version than Matthew's, suggesting that what was being preserved was a pattern of approach rather than a precisely fixed sequence of words. The irony, and it is an irony rich enough to spend a lifetime with, is this: the prayer that Jesus gave specifically as an antidote to vain repetition, specifically as a response to the empty, mechanical, performance-oriented prayer of the Pharisees and the babbling formulas of the pagans, has itself become, in many parts of the world and many corners of the church, exactly what it was designed to replace. Words said fast without thought, at the beginning of a school board meeting or before a sporting event or in a hospital chapel, by people whose minds are elsewhere and whose mouths are operating on autopilot. This is not a condemnation. It is simply what happens to living things when they are institutionalized. They are preserved, and in the preserving, something of the original vitality can be lost. The shell remains. The fire inside goes out. And what Jesus gave was fire. This is the real question the Lord's Prayer poses to anyone who has said it. Not, are you saying it correctly? Not, do you have the right translation? Not, does your denomination include the Doxology? The real question is, are you praying it? Or are you reciting it? Are you inside the words? or are you in front of them? When you say Our Father, do you feel even a flicker of what that word Abba meant? The intimacy, the trust, the belonging. When you say Your kingdom come, do you mean it? Do you mean it in the way that Corrie ten Boom meant it in Ravensbruck, or the way the soldiers at Omaha Beach meant it, or the way the martyrs in the arenas of Rome meant it, with everything at stake, with no irony available, with nowhere else to turn? Because that is the prayer that moved mountains. And that prayer is available to you, right now, exactly as you are. Our Father. The theologian Tim Keller, writing about the Lord's Prayer, offered an observation that has stayed with many readers. The prayer is not primarily a set of requests. It is a description of a relationship. Each petition reflects a different dimension of what it means to be in relationship with the God Jesus called Abba. Hallowed be your name is the dimension of awe. Your kingdom come is the dimension of longing. Give us daily bread is the dimension of trust. Forgive us our debts is the dimension of honesty. Let us not into temptation is the dimension of vulnerability. And deliver us from evil is the dimension of dependence. When you pray the Lord's Prayer slowly enough to feel each of those dimensions, you are not reciting a formula. You are being remade, gradually, daily, prayer by prayer. In the 21st century, a new field of scientific inquiry has turned its instruments toward the very thing we have been exploring tonight. Neurotheology, the scientific study of what happens in the human brain during spiritual experience, has produced a body of research that is, to put it plainly, impossible to dismiss. And the findings that bear most directly on the Lord's Prayer are among the most remarkable. Dr. Andrew Newberg, a neuroscientist at Thomas Jefferson University in Philadelphia, has spent decades studying the brains of people engaged in focused, contemplative prayer, the kind of slow, deliberate engagement with each word of a text like the Lord's Prayer that we have been describing. His research has documented measurable changes in brain activity associated with this kind of practice. Reduced activity in the parietal lobe, the region associated with the sense of a separate self, of hard boundaries between you and the rest of the world. Reduced cortisol levels, the primary stress hormone, the physiological marker of anxiety and threat response. Increased activity in the frontal lobe, the region associated with focus, empathy, ethical reasoning, and the integration of complex information. In short, the practice of focused, repetitive prayer produces a brain that is, quite literally, less anxious, more connected, more capable of compassion. The prayer that Jesus taught as a daily discipline turns out to have daily, measurable neurological effects. The forgiveness petition has received perhaps the most sustained scientific attention. The psychology of forgiveness is one of the most active research areas in the field of clinical psychology, and the findings are consistent and striking. A review of the peer-reviewed research, published across multiple journals over the past 2 decades, has established that the practice of forgiveness, not as a spontaneous emotional event but as a deliberate, repeated decision made in the face of genuine grievance, is associated with significant reductions in depression, anxiety, chronic stress, cardiovascular risk, and immune system dysfunction. Forgiveness is not merely a spiritual virtue. It is measurably and demonstrably one of the most powerful mental health interventions available to the human being. And Jesus, 2,000 years before the peer-reviewed literature, built it into a daily prayer. Every day, at the center of the most recited text in human history, forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. Every day, a renewal of the decision to let it go. Every day, a small neurological act of liberation that accumulated, over a lifetime of prayer, into a person measurably more capable of love. And there is something even simpler than the neuroscience. There is the basic, irreducible human fact of the communal address. Our Father. In a world that is in many ways the loneliest world in human history, a world of unprecedented individual isolation, of social media connection that mimics community without providing it, of epidemic loneliness that public health officials in multiple countries have now officially classified as a crisis, the Lord's Prayer opens with the oldest and most powerful antidote to loneliness ever devised. You are not alone. You are praying with someone. Even in the private room that Jesus recommended, with the door closed, you are part of an hour that stretches back 2,000 years and forward into a future you will never see. Billions of voices, every language, every circumstance. Our Father, you are not the only one who has ever knelt in the dark. We are nearing the end of our journey tonight. But before we close, There are stories that need to be told. Real stories, human stories, moments in the long, extraordinary, still continuing life of the Lord's Prayer where the words ceased to be theology and became something more immediate, something survival-sized. We have already heard from the soldiers at Omaha Beach, from Corrie in Ravensbruck, from the early martyrs in the Roman arenas. But the prayer's life in ordinary, non-dramatic, everyday human history is just as significant, just as worth pausing over. There is a documented account, preserved in the personal papers now held at the Library of Congress, of a Union soldier in the American Civil War, a private from Ohio named Nathan Galloway, who wrote in a letter to his mother in October 1863, from a field hospital at Chattanooga, Tennessee, where he was recovering from a wound received at Chickamauga. He wrote, "I have said the Lord's Prayer every day since I was 7 years old and never understood it until 3 days ago when I thought I was going to die of this wound in the dark and no one near me." He wrote that in those hours, alone, in pain, convinced he was dying, the words of the prayer had come into focus in a way they never had in the comfortable domesticity of his Ohio childhood. He wrote, "When I said Our Father, I felt it meant something I can't put into words. Like I wasn't alone in the way I thought I was." Nathan Galloway survived his wound. He went home to Ohio. He had 6 children. He was a Baptist Sunday school teacher for the rest of his long life. He never stopped saying the prayer. He never again said it without feeling what he had felt in that field hospital. There is the story of a South Korean pastor named Andrew Kim, who was imprisoned by the North Korean government in 2014 on charges of espionage and anti-state activities, and held for 2 years in a facility where he had no access to a Bible, no contact with other Christians, and no knowledge of when or whether he would be released. In a later account given after his release, Kim described how he survived those 2 years. He had the Lord's Prayer. He had committed it to memory as a child, in his Sunday school in Seoul. And in the cell in North Korea with nothing else, he prayed it. Every morning, every evening, sometimes many times in the middle of the night when the fear was worst. He said that the line that sustained him most was the final petition, "But deliver us from evil." He said he prayed that line with an intensity he had never imagined possible, not as a religious formality but as a man clutching a rope in a river current. And he said he felt, in the praying of it, something he could only describe as the presence of the one being addressed. Not comfort exactly, not rescue, but presence. The sense of not being ultimately, cosmically, alone in the cell. And then there is this. On July 20th, 1969, the day Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin landed on the moon, while the entire world was watching the grainy television footage of the Eagle descending toward the lunar surface, a woman named Viola Armstrong sat in her home in Wapakoneta, Ohio, and prayed. She was Neil Armstrong's mother, and she prayed the Lord's Prayer. She had taught it to her son when he was a boy, as parents across the English-speaking world had been teaching it to their children for as long as anyone could remember. And on the night her son, her specific son, her flesh and blood, set foot on another world for the first time in human history, the prayer that came out of her was the one she had always known. Our Father, who art in heaven. The prayer spoken by a frightened crowd on a Galilean hillside under Roman occupation traveled, in the hands and hearts of ordinary people across 2,000 years, all the way to the moon. And it came back. And it still works. 3 hours ago we asked a question. Why do these 66 words still move people to tears? Why do they still stop soldiers and prisoners and mothers in their tracks? Why do they still generate papal controversies and neuroscience studies and theological debates? We have spent a long time together tonight, and now we can try to answer. Not definitively. These words have resisted definitive answers for 2,000 years, and they will resist ours. But honestly, with the full weight of everything we have explored, the Lord's Prayer still works because it tells the truth about the human condition without flinching and without lying. It does not pretend that life is not hard. It asks for daily bread because bread is not guaranteed, and it never has been, and everyone who has ever lived has known it. It asks for forgiveness because we have all done things we cannot undo and we all know it. It asks for deliverance from evil because evil is real and is a genuine threat, and the person who denies this has either lived a very sheltered life or has stopped paying attention. This prayer does not offer the cheap comfort of a God who makes all the hard things disappear. It offers the radical comfort of a God who is present in the hard things, who knows about the hard things, who cares about the hard things, and who has something to say about them. Something that begins with our. The Lord's Prayer still works because it insists on community in a world that insists on individualism. That opening pronoun, our, has been fighting the tide of human self-centeredness for 2,000 years and is still fighting it. In every age, in every culture, the drift of human psychology is toward the self. My bread, my forgiveness, my kingdom, my will. The prayer refuses this. You cannot say Our Father without acknowledging that the person next to you has the same Father. You cannot pray Our daily bread and be entirely indifferent to whether the person next to you has bread. You cannot pray Forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors and hold a grievance forever without feeling the contradiction. The prayer is an ongoing, daily, impossible to fully honor invitation to live outside the closed system of the self. And the invitation is not comfortable. But it is the direction in which human beings become more human. And the Lord's Prayer still works because it is organized around a truth about the nature of attention that every human being who has ever lived has discovered and then forgotten and then rediscovered again. The prayer begins with God. Not with my needs. Not with my fears. Not with my agenda. With God. Hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come. Your will be done. By the time we arrive at Give us our daily bread, the first petition that addresses human need, we have already spent 3 lines reorienting our attention away from the self and toward something larger. And that reorientation is not incidental to the prayer. It is the prayer. It is the thing the prayer does to you if you let it. It gradually, daily, imperceptibly reshapes the direction of your attention and the shape of your desire until you begin, slightly, imperfectly, fitfully, hopefully, to want what the prayer says matters. The kingdom, the will, the bread for everyone, the forgiveness of everyone, the deliverance of everyone. Jesus stood on that hillside in Galilee 2,000 years ago, looked out at a crowd of frightened and exhausted and hungry and desperate people. People crushed by taxes and occupied by soldiers and betrayed by their own institutions. And he gave them this. 6 lines. 66 words. He did not give them a political revolution. He did not give them a military strategy. He did not give them a new institution or a new hierarchy or a new set of rules. He gave them a prayer. He gave them words to put in their mouths that would slowly, over time, change the shape of their hearts. And those words, carried in human mouths across every border and every century and every catastrophe and every joy and every ordinary Monday morning, are still doing exactly what he intended them to do, still shaping hearts, still drawing people into a community they did not know they were joining, still insisting, against all available evidence to the contrary, that the one who holds the universe in being is close enough to be called Daddy, and that this matters more than anything the empire can do to you. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. I want to ask you something before you go. We have spent tonight going deep inside 66 words. Deeper than most people go in a lifetime of praying them. And I want to know what you found. Which line of the Lord's Prayer landed differently for you tonight? Which petition do you think you have been saying the longest without truly hearing? Was it the radical communal opening? Was it your kingdom come, the political bombshell in the middle? Was it, as we forgive our debtors, the hardest assignment Jesus ever gave? Drop it in the comments. Tell me. I read every single one. And if someone in your life needs to hear this story tonight, someone who says this prayer and has never known what they were really saying, share this video with them. That is how stories like this travel, person to person, the same way the prayer itself traveled, 2,000 years ago, from mouth to ear to heart. And if you are new here, welcome. This is Fireside Bible Study. This is what we do. We take the stories inside the Bible that the whole world has heard about but few people have truly gone inside, and we go inside them. All the way. No shortcuts. No comfortable summaries. Just the full, extraordinary, complicated, world-altering truth of what these ancient stories actually contain. We have so many more stories to tell you. Stories that are already in production, already waiting for you. Stories that will surprise you just as much as the one you heard tonight. Hit subscribe right now so that when those stories are ready, and they are coming, you are here for them. You are already part of this. You said our Father, didn't you? That means you are already in the family. We will see you for the next one.